Hey class, how you guys all doing? So today is Tuesday, April 21st, and we are going to continue the period of the 1830s and 40s. In the last class, the Age of Jackson, we talked about sort of the leading figure of that time, Andrew Jackson, important enough that he wound up on the $20 bill. But today in our lecture, we're going to use a different person as a way to get a window into that time period. A much less well-known person, but important in different ways, who's going to give us a way to attack some of the different ideas of that same basic time period. So it may be the Age of Jackson, and there's a book with that title that I ripped off, but it is also the Age of Van Buren, specifically Martin Van Buren, who is an important figure in his era and largely forgotten today because when he was president, he wasn't very successful. So first of all, Martin Van Buren is going to allow us to get at the political parties that developed at that time. Um, it's worth just remembering that Americans certainly like political parties. We heard that George Washington, during his farewell address, had spoken out against the factions that had developed, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. He and other Americans were convinced that any kind of organized partisanship would be bad for the country. They're learning lessons, they think, from the British, but also they're convinced that any kind of internal division is going to weaken the country and weaken the republic. And so even the leading figures of most of the factions had always said factions are bad, and we're hoping that after the next election, the other faction would go away, and then they could just sort of go their merry way, as did happen during the era of good feelings. And yet there does seem to be something inherently partisan in the idea of elections. And therefore, it's going to take a little while, but the idea of organized political parties are going to be here to stay. And the key figure here is Martin Van Buren. He is the leader of a group called the Bucktails, which is a group of Republicans in upstate New York in the 1820s. So during the era of good feelings, when there were just Republicans, that made it very hard for people to get into the inner circle of politics because some people already ran the local parties. In the case of New York State, the Republicans were basically run by the governor of the state, who had previously been the mayor, who was one of the wealthiest men in the state, and really ran the party just to sort of dole out favors to his friends and allies. And for people who weren't on the ins, especially people who didn't know that governor well or from different parts of the state, this was very concerning because they felt that they were going to have no chance to get in. So there's a group of a group of Republicans from upstate New York called the Bucktails, and a lot of the political groups that are sort of branches, local branches of political parties in the 19th century have sort of strange names like that. They usually have some sort of Native American connotation, and this one similarly does. Um, Van Buren and the upstate Republicans known as the Bucktails presented themselves as sort of an alternate force within the state Republican Party. And they objected to the way the Republicans were being ruled. They said that it shouldn't be one individual or the clique of people who were close to the leader who made all the decisions. That was very undemocratic. It seemed to them very much opposed to the republicanism ideals of the country. And Van Buren, sort of their leader, the key leading figure, developed a new idea of what politics should be. He said political parties should be run democratically. The idea should be that rather than one individual making all the decisions, instead, it should be all of the group. Every member of the party should be able to have their say. What he's proposing is decision making within the party be using something called the caucus. In a caucus, all the members of a particular group get together and then they hash out whatever their particular issue is internally. So basically, shut the doors and you have your discussion about whatever the issue is. And it might be, should we support this candidate? It might be, should we support this piece of legislation? It might be, what should our policy be on a particular issue or whatever. And all the key figures in the party should then get a chance to say their piece, no matter how important they are. And then, after everyone has had a chance to speak up, then everyone votes. And then that decision made by the caucus will be the decision of the whole party. So this is more democratic because everyone gets a chance to speak. But the key is that after the decision is made, everyone in the party needs to support the decision that they made as a whole. And this, according to Van Buren and the Bucktails, would be a much better way to determine who should move up in the party ranks. In the previous way, basically you got to move up if you were loyal to the leader. In this case, if you're loyal to the majority, if you're loyal to the decision made by the majority, if afterwards you help support whatever the policy that they decided on, you help support the candidacy of whichever candidate they decided on, people who show themselves as loyal to the party and loyal to the majority will of the caucus, those are the sorts of people who will be picked for advancement. So if you do a good job of supporting your local candidate, then maybe the next time around you'll get to be a candidate in some smaller thing. When you get to be in an office and you support the ideas of the party when you're in office, then maybe they'll reward you by nominating you for a higher office, and so forth. So advancement, therefore, should be based on loyalty, but it's loyalty to that majority will in the caucus. Ultimately, Van Buren and the Bucktails were able to take over the state Republican Party in New York in the mid 1820s with these ideas, and Van Buren began to expand on his original ideas by arguing that a political party based on the principles that I just laid out would be good for the country. And specifically, Van Buren called for organized political parties, and he believed that there should be more than one of them. Van Buren felt that having more than one political party would be good because that wouldn't lead to negativity or dissension, that actually would make sure that the party in power always has some sort of a check on their power. So knowing that you have to win the next election, and therefore you have to appeal to the voters in the next election, that's one thing if there is only one party. Then you basically just need to control your party. But if there's more than one party, if you do a bad job, the other party is going to win in the next election. And their job is going to be to tell the voters all the mistakes that you make. So if there is more than one party, that is going to keep the party in power from acting with corruption. That is going to keep the party in power from making bad decisions. Or if they make bad decisions, the party out of power's job is to explain to the people why those decisions were bad. So what Van Buren is saying is that a two-party system is like another check in the checks and balances system. That having a party out of power that wants to get into power is going to make sure that whoever has the reins, that they are limited in what they try to get away with, and they are limited in the mistakes that they can make because then they will pay the consequences in the next election. Van Buren felt that these ideas, which the Bucktails had developed in the state of New York, these ideas would be very valuable if they went to the national level. And he is enunciating these ideas, and they're coming up with these ideas during the era of good feelings when there was only the one party. The Republicans were the only party after the Federalists went out of business. And what Van Buren is watching is what he is convinced is proof that a single party government really doesn't work. Because he's watching elections that don't seem to make much sense. He is watching the rise of issues that to him a two-party system would make less likely. He is convinced, for example, that the Missouri controversy in the early 1820s was really the result of the lack of discipline that was the result of just having one party, because then they fought amongst themselves. In a two-party system, then one party would pick sort of one side of the issue and the other party pick the other side of the issue, and then the voters would just pick, as opposed to just everybody fighting it out the way it happened during the Missouri controversy, which got very ugly. So Van Buren is hoping that he can take these ideas of politics and move to the center of the government and bring them with him to help develop a two-party system the way they have tried it in New York. The election of 1824, it became clear to him that the leading light, that the major guy who he needed to follow was Andrew Jackson. These two guys don't really have much in common. Jackson is from the West and a Southerner and a slave owner, and Van Buren is from upstate New York. In many ways, their style is very different. Their manner of speaking. But Van Buren was impressed by Jackson's personal touch and the kind of thrill that the voters had with him. And so Van Buren got in touch with Andrew Jackson after the election of 1824, and they began this robust political correspondence. They really found a meeting of the minds, because although in a lot of specific policy issues they may not exactly have the same background, they had a lot of similar ideas about how politics should work. And ultimately, when Jackson did win election in 1828, that was the Reform, Recovery, and Retrenchment election, and became president in 1829, he brought Andrew Jackson to his administration in the most important cabinet position of the time, which is Secretary of State. Pretty much all, with Jackson as the exception, of the previous half dozen presidents had been Secretary of State first and then moved into the presidency. So this is a very important job. You'll recall that it was Van Buren who came up with the solution to the Peggy Eaton scandal. During that whole 2 years where Jackson was refusing to meet with his cabinet, Van Buren eventually said, listen, why don't we just all resign and then you can start all over again? And so Van Buren and Jackson continued to be quite simpatico. After Van Buren resigned the Secretary of State, Jackson gave him quite a plum position. He gave him the ambassadorship to England, which was at the time considered to be the most important and most prestigious and the most fun job if you're going to be an ambassador, because London is a rich and wealthy and interesting place to be. So after Jackson and Calhoun had their final falling out, which had been long coming, but certainly after it was clear that Calhoun was really a nullifier and didn't have the same basic principles that Jackson did, then it was very sensible for Jackson to pick Van Buren as his vice presidential running mate when he ran for re-election in 1832. And Van Buren served as his vice president and basically heir apparent. So in 1836, when Jackson retired and went back to Tennessee, he let the Democrats know, he let his supporters know that this guy, Martin Van Buren, should be the person who should follow him into office. In the process, Jackson and Van Buren built the first true political party around the two of them. So the Democratic Party was created in the 1830s with Andrew Jackson as its first leader, although truly you could say that Martin Van Buren was its architect. Van Buren had the vision for what a political party should look like and the role that parties should play in the country. Jackson was the leader, the popular figure around which the two men built the Democratic Party, and this is the same Democratic Party that exists today, although when I describe some of the things that they stood for, they may not sound like quite the same thing, but there's been a lot of changes over the times. In the 1830s, when the Democratic Party was created, with Jackson as its first leader, and then after he left the White House, then he turned it over to Martin Van Buren to follow him, the Democratic Party built itself around the things and the people that Jackson supported. And so, therefore, it was Jeffersonian in its ideals, believed in a limited federal government, emphasized states' rights, was much stronger in the South and in the West than it was in the North, has somewhat limited support in the North, and opposed high tariffs, opposed the national bank, all the kinds of things that that Andrew Jackson strongly supported. In the South, therefore, it supported slavery. In the West, it opposed any kind of Native Americans having land. And we'll hear more about that particular topic later, but that's the biggest issue for white Southerners is they want to take the land of the Native Americans. So that's what the Democratic Party is in the 1830s, the party of Jackson, because those are Jackson's emphases, and the party that Van Buren builds around Jackson, which will then, he thinks, win lots of elections and hopefully win elections for him as well. The opposition party, and remember, Van Buren believed in opposition. He believed that there should be an alternate political party. He thought that was good for the country. The opposition party took a little bit longer to get organized. Ultimately, an opposition party to the Democrats was created. They call themselves the Whigs, and that's Whigs. They are named after a political group in England. In England, the Whigs are the party that is in opposition to the King's party. People who join the Whigs are people who hate Andrew Jackson, and a lot of them hate Andrew Jackson because they think he's too big for his britches. They think he's acting like he wants to be the king. They refer to him as King Andy, and there's caricatures and cartoons like that. And so anybody who hates Andrew Jackson eventually builds themselves as a Whig, and for a little while that makes the Whigs very confusing because on the one hand, the Whigs are people like Henry Clay who oppose Andrew Jackson because they would like a stronger federal government, more government role in the economy. But they also are people like John C. Calhoun who hate Andrew Jackson because they don't think he goes far enough with states' rights. That makes the Whigs sort of a loose coalition and not very well organized at first. After a little while, the Calhoun element did fade away, especially after Andrew Jackson died, because Calhoun is a deep Southerner, and many of the most extreme states' rights people eventually wound up in the Democratic Party, although that was a number of years later. But at first, it's a little bit confused, but ultimately, the Whigs are basically the Henry Clay Party, the party that represents the ideals that Clay has been talking about since the 18 teens. They are stronger in the North. They're strong in New England and other parts of the North. They are the party that believes in a stronger federal role in the economy. They are going to support higher tariffs. They're going to support banking. They're going to focus on what's good for business people, what's good for elites, because they think that those leaders of the country are the ones who need to be supported to make sure that the country overall is healthy, economically sound, and can move forward prosperously. Eventually, the Calhoun wing of the Whigs faded away, and that basically became the Whigs. They're not a successful party. There's a reason why you've probably never heard of them. They're not going to last incredibly long. They're not going to have a lot of major national success, but they are the alternate political party. And the Democrats versus the Whigs is the first truly organized political partisan separation in this country. Previously, we had the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. They were factions. They're not organized the same way that a party is. By the 1830s, and certainly by the election of 1840, as we'll see, we have two organized political parties that are organized at the national level that are basically businesses to elect people. And they are run on the principles of Martin Van Buren and the Bucktails, with these caucuses, with the majority rule being the decision-making process, and they see themselves as working for the public good, although their philosophies are different. Their goal is not just to win elections, but they believe that their ideals will help the country, and therefore they want to keep going, and so they raise money, they have newspapers, they have propaganda, and then they push for their candidacies and their policies. Okay, so that's the two political parties, and whether you like it or not, partisanship is here to stay, and because we're a country based on elections, political parties do exist. The Whigs don't exist anymore. We're going to see what happened to them and who replaces them, and I promise you by the end of our semester, we will have the two major political parties of today, although they won't exactly match up ideologically to the two political parties of today because, history. But as I said, Andrew Jackson is the leading figure of the Democratic Party, and Martin Van Buren is the architect of the Democratic Party, and therefore, as Jackson stepped off and went back to Tennessee to retire, he told the Democrats that Van Buren should be the candidate, and Van Buren was nominated by the Democratic Party in 1836 to be president to follow Jackson into office. He is the first presidential candidate nominated by a major actual party. And he won quite easily in 1836, partly because he is following in the footsteps of an incredibly popular president. Jackson, as we've heard previously, was very popular. He had his enemies, of course, but overall quite popular. And Van Buren is expressing himself as following in his footsteps, and he will just follow the example of the founder of the party. But also, it helps Van Buren a lot that the Whigs, his opposition party, are not really well organized yet. The Whigs thought politics was going to work the way it had during the era of good feelings, when it was presidential elections would really be sort of regional, and your goal was win your area and then get some votes in some other places. And so the Whigs really couldn't decide on a candidate in 1836, scattered their strength. They're just getting started anyway, and so they lost easily. So Van Buren got to be president. He takes office in early 1837, expecting that he will be just as successful and just as popular as his predecessor, Andrew Jackson, because after all, the two of these guys together created the party, which they believe should be the big national party, and Jackson was successful. So why wouldn't Martin Van Buren? As it turns out, though, Martin Van Buren, and the reason why you haven't really heard of him before, Van Buren is left holding the bag for some policies that Jackson began but was not able to resolve. And certainly in one major case, these policies blew up in his face. And Van Buren discovered that sometimes it's not great to follow a popular and well-loved leader, especially if that leader has left some simmering things that haven't been resolved. And so we're going to see that Van Buren is not a successful president, although he was a successful politician in so many other ways. So the first of the major legacies that Andrew Jackson bequeaths to Martin Van Buren is economic. If you remember the bank war of the last lecture, Jackson hated the Bank of the United States, wanted to destroy it. After the bank veto of 1832, Jackson was convinced that the Bank of the United States was too destructive to be allowed to live, and so he and Roger Taney removed the government money from the Bank of the United States, totally illegally, of course, and then eventually distributed that money to all the so-called pet banks run by allies of theirs, smaller banks scattered throughout the country. And I said at the time that that actually stimulated the economy. When the pet banks got all this government money in 1833 and then continued to get government money in the years after that, that gave them access to cash that they previously wouldn't have had. And so they started making loans in their local communities that helped stimulate the economy, and that was, for a short period of time, that was good. However, a lot of those loans turned out to be bad loans, and the economy essentially got kind of overheated as a result of Jackson's policies. In addition, there's some other economic policies that Jackson supported, all the details of which you don't need to know. But overall, Jackson helped overheat or sort of supercharge the economy, and especially build up sort of a balloon, a bubble, I guess, in the banking sector that then popped right after Jackson left office. So Van Buren had been president for weeks. He barely found the bathrooms in the White House. And then suddenly the entire banking sector collapsed in what's called the Panic of 1837. You'll remember the Panic of 1819 when the banking sector had collapsed. This one was bigger and much more consequential because in the meantime, in the intervening 2 decades, the U.S. economy had grown. There were more people relying on the banks, and when the banks all collapsed, largely because some of the pet banks collapsed, as some of the loans they made turned out to be bad loans, and then they went bankrupt, and then other banks that borrowed money from them went bankrupt, and has a ripple effect all throughout the banking system. And basically all the banks in New York, which is the most important banking place then and now in the U.S., as they all essentially collapsed, then suddenly a lot of businesses found that they didn't have access to capital, that the money supply is simply not there, and a lot of businesses shut down, which means that people are laid off from their jobs. That hadn't been as much of a problem in 1819 because the U.S. economy was almost completely farm-based, and so the Panic of 1819 mostly affected people who had borrowed money from banks, or it affected sort of the East Coast cities. But by 1837, the economy is beginning to get a little bit more sophisticated, which means more people are connected to these banks that then suddenly collapse. And the result of the Panic of 1837 is what I'd have to say was probably a depression, a major economic downturn with many people out of work, with people scrambling for jobs, with business people scrambling to keep their businesses open, laying off a lot of their employees, paying them less, and so forth. It's a major economic catastrophe, and it doesn't really turn around until the early 1840s, which is really, really bad luck for Martin Van Buren, because Martin Van Buren is president when the economy goes into the dumper. And I mean, I'm sorry, but that's just bad luck on his part. But when the economy collapses, ultimately the person who takes the blame is the leader of the country, which is the president of the United States. Van Buren, unbeknownst to him, has broken Santangelo's first rule of politics, which is never, ever, ever, ever be president when there's a major recession or a depression. It doesn't matter if you can try to blame someone else or say, well, it's not my fault, or these other circumstances led to this or whatever. Ultimately, the people are going to be angry. They're going to look for someone to blame, and the buck stops at the White House. So it was very, very hard to escape the political consequences of a major economic downturn. And Van Buren, the first one to experience this, found that he became incredibly unpopular almost from day one. It didn't help that he had sort of a personal style that was very flamboyant, and he continued to have big parties and sort of fancy dress events at the White House, which looked very tone deaf. It looked like he didn't really understand that other people were suffering and they're out of jobs and standing in line for food and so forth. That didn't look good. It also doesn't help that there's really not much he can do because at that time the president has very little impact on the economy, and the federal government overall had very few tools that it could use to get involved in the economy and to try to spruce it up or to resolve problems or whatever. Um, but even if such things existed, Van Buren really ideologically would not have been able to use them because he ran for president as a Democrat, and the Democrats in those days believed that the government should not get involved in the economy. It would have been hypocritical for him to do anything other than to do what he did, which is to basically say, it's going to turn around, things are going to be fine, we all are in this together, let's be optimistic, and after the banking sector recovers, then the overall economy will recover and we're going to be fine. And in the long run, he was right because the economy did rebound, because the economy always rebounds, or at least it always has. Um, and so he was right in the long run, but the long run was longer than he would have wanted because the economy still was bad all for the rest of his presidency. And so he's sitting in the White House trying to figure out if there's anything he can do. There's really nothing he can do. He doesn't have really any connection to the economy, doesn't have really any, well, I mean, there's one thing he could do. I mean, if you want to just think out of the box a little bit, one possibility, if the problem was set off by the banking sector, if the banks were too weak or structurally inefficient or whatever, then one possibility might be for some sort of oversight of the banking system. And so just thinking out loud here, he could support some sort of national bank of some sort, that would be strong enough that it could sort of lead all the other banks and, the people could trust it. I mean, he could do that, but he can't because that's not what the Democratic Party stands for. That's not what Andrew Jackson stands for. Jackson had crushed the Bank of the United States. And honestly, it probably could have helped if it was still there. But there's no way that Van Buren can support anything like that because he's a Democrat, and that's not what the Democrats stand for. So, Van Buren, as president, falls prey to this particular legacy of Andrew Jackson's. Jackson left behind an unstable economy that basically went to pieces right after he left office, and Van Buren was left holding the bag and taking all the blame, and ultimately it destroyed his presidency. If the economy had recovered before the next election, he might have been in better shape, but he wasn't that lucky, and he becomes an incredibly unpopular president as the economy slipped very deep into recession, depression, somewhere in that range. It's pretty bad. All right, so that's one legacy of Andrew Jackson that Van Buren has to deal with, and he can't really deal with it because it's just a tough situation. He doesn't have any tools to address it other than time, and there's time's going to run out on him. In the meantime, there was another legacy of Jackson's presidency that I haven't really done much more than allude to, that's going to come to fruition or sort of come to a certain amount of closure during Van Buren's presidency, not in a way that today we would feel very comfortable with, um, but is an important topic and relates to one of the themes that we've had all semester, which is related to Native Americans. Specifically, I'm going to draw your attention to the southern part of the country. Because down there, in places like modern day Tennessee and Georgia and Alabama, there were large areas that Native American tribes controlled and continued to control that they had been on for generations, for centuries, really. Um, the basic Native American policy at the time of the early leaders of the country, so your George Washingtons and your Thomas Jeffersons, had been that where there were tribes in any large numbers within the confines, the boundaries of the U.S., the federal government, acting on behalf of the whole country, would sign treaties with those tribes where the tribes would be guaranteed certain amount of the land that they had previously controlled or that they lived on. Um, and then other land they would sort of give to the federal government, and then white people would eventually get to move there. And the theory was that if the government signed these treaties with these tribes, and the tribes would know that they would have that land without anybody interfering with them for a while, in the meantime, the overall policy of the country would be to try to encourage what they called civilization, what I would call more assimilation. The goal, the government goal, and the overall cultural goal of the country in the early days of the Republic was hoping that Native Americans would become more like their white neighbors. Um, so this sounds horrific today. I'm going to tell you that of the Native American policies we hear in this lecture, this is actually the better one, which is hard to imagine. Um, so the federal government had money that it used to try to encourage assimilationist policies. And then also there were missionary groups and other organizations that then worked with or came down to and lived among the Native American tribes in the Southeast with the goal of encouraging assimilation. And these tribes, and they are the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, the Creeks, the Cherokees, and the Seminoles, these five tribes ultimately got the nickname as a group, the Five Civilized Tribes, because of these efforts by the government and especially by missionary groups to try to encourage assimilation and try to encourage cultural changes with the ultimate goal of trying to make the Native American peoples of the American Southeast roughly similar to their white neighbors, to the point where eventually you go far enough into the future that they would be essentially indistinguishable. That was the theory. And there were significant changes in the lifestyles of many of the people in these tribes. They began to engage in agricultural practices that were similar to their white neighbors. Start putting fences on their land, growing things for to sell at the market, to sell in the marketplace. Um, this land is good cotton growing land, and we'll hear more about cotton in the next lecture. Um, but some of the Native American tribes began to have cotton plantations. The most so called civilized of the tribes, the Cherokees, not only adapted wide scale cotton plantation farming, but they even began to purchase African American slaves, which I don't know if that's a sign of civilization, but it certainly is a sign that they were buying into some of the ideals of the people around them. Um, the Cherokees get the nickname as the most civilized, and again, that's in quotes because that's a very loaded term. Um, Partly because they politically and economically resembled their white neighbors the most, but also because in some cultural traits they began to have some changes. For example, the Cherokees became the first Native American tribe anywhere in the Americas to have a written language. One of their leaders took their spoken language and then created an alphabet, and then began to write in that alphabet some of the specific things that they said, turning that into written language. Ultimately, the Cherokee people even had a Cherokee tribal newspaper that was similar to what you might find, the Washington Post or whatever. Um, so uh, the problem is that for some of their white neighbors, so some of the people living in the states of Tennessee and Alabama and Georgia and so forth, um, by the early 19th century, some of these neighbors are getting close to and encroaching on the land of the Native Americans and wishing those Native Americans weren't there because the land that the Native Americans are on is good growing land. Um, the white people are continuing to wish and try to push for more land that sort of from the very early colonial days had been the secret to their success. The idea that there always is another place you can start over if you just go a little bit farther to the west. And there was tremendous resentment on the frontier between the white people who want to get into that land and the Native Americans who are resisting any encroachment on their territory. So, in these states, in Georgia, which is one of the 13 original colonies, and then in these new states as they opened up, first as territories and then as states, uh, the politics of those states and the politics generally of the frontier states, um, the farmers and other settlers of those states resented the Native Americans to a fierceness where they wanted to take their land and to just make the Native Americans disappear, whether that means literally or in some less unpleasant figurative sense. Um, the basic political ideology of the white settler of the frontier area is this land should be ours. That's the basic philosophy. Um, and people began to question the old federal strategy, the old Washington and Jefferson early days strategy of these treaties that guaranteed these large amounts of land to the tribes in places that, in some cases, the Cherokees, the land that they controlled was roughly a third of the state of Georgia, and there are people in Georgia and these other states as well who are wanting to get that land and are saying that the federal government made a mistake in guaranteeing in the old treaties that that land would be theirs. So that anger on the part of the white people, on the part of the white settlers, eventually led to a lot of tension, and there's friction that takes place. It really doesn't help that, especially for the Cherokees, that gold was discovered in the land that was on their reservation, because then the people in the state of Georgia really desperately want to get onto that land and resented the fact that the Native Americans are going to get the wealth from that gold because, in the point of view of the white folks, the Native Americans are uncivilized, barbaric. No matter how much they are changing, they are still a lesser group of people. And that was the white, especially the white settlers' point of view, in a kind of virulent racism that hopefully we have managed to move away from, although I don't always know if that's true. So, um, eventually, a new philosophy toward the Native Americans appeared in the politics of the country um, and found its most well known advocate in Andrew Jackson. Jackson was inspired by a magazine article that he read written by the governor of Michigan, a guy named Lewis Cass. Cass in 1830 um, had put together some ideas that other people in the frontier areas had been talking about for a while and promulgated them in a national magazine that helped bring a new philosophy toward the Native Americans out into the forefront. Lewis Cass advocated for new treaties with the Native Americans. He's thinking about some smaller Native American tribes in the north, but he's very much, the whole country is very much thinking about the five so-called civilized tribes because of how much land they controlled. What he is proposing is that in new treaties, that the government work out a deal with these Native American tribes whereby they would agree to give up their land in the more eastern part of the country, basically give up their land east of the Mississippi River, the land that the white people want to get to, the land where their white neighbors are starting to surround them and are going to barge in and take that land at some point anyway. If the federal government gets those tribes to agree to give up their land, then the government would then sponsor moving those tribes to a territory reserved just for the Native Americans west of the Mississippi River. And so the idea is that the government would manage an Indian territory west of the Mississippi River and then help the Native Americans after they have given up the land that they had lived on for centuries, for millennia, um, help them move to that Indian territory and then provide them with some support at first while they get going. So, Jackson read this magazine article and was very impressed by the ideas of it, and he himself was a noted Native American fighter. Um, while he was in the military in the years before he became president, In addition to fighting the Battle of New Orleans, which made him a true national figure, most of the rest of his military experience was fighting against Native American tribes because there was conflict at various places where one tribe or another would fight back against the incursions of the local white people against them. And then the army would come and try to sort of settle the matter. And they did that always by basically defeating the Native American uprisings. And so Jackson personally had a lot of experience fighting against Native American tribes in various parts of the Southeast. And he personally loathed the Native Americans, was convinced, as was the case of many white settlers, white frontiers people, was convinced that the Native Americans were lesser than the white people and does not deserve to have all the land that they were living on, even though, of course, they have been living there for generations. That's not his problem as far as he's concerned. Um, Jackson is sort of weird on this issue because although in general he has an extreme loathing for Native Americans, he also occasionally individually felt respect for individual Native Americans. And in fact, after one military expedition where he and his soldiers had essentially laid waste to an entire Native American village, then they found an infant child who had survived the devastation, and he took the child with him and then adopted the child and raised him as a son, which is a strange way to act given that he was responsible for the fact that the kid's family were all destroyed. Um, but anyway, he's a man of contradictions. Overall, though, Jackson felt strongly the same way that other white frontiersmen felt that the Native Americans were a problem, or a problem for him, or a problem for the white people. And therefore, when Lewis Cass proposed this idea, Jackson thought it was a great solution to the problem. And so Jackson proposed that Congress pass a law to enact the Lewis Cass idea. And Congress complied in 1830 with the Indian Removal Act, which Jackson strongly supported, which he strongly advocated for, arguing that this would be good for everybody. Removing the Native Americans, taking them away from the land that they'd lived on for generations, and putting them west of the Mississippi, he felt not only would be good for the white people who could then take their land, but he also thought it would be good for the Native Americans because it would get them out of the way of the onrush of the white people who were desirous for their land. This is possibly a little bit of wishful thinking, although some supporters of the Indian Removal Act idea did think that if they move the Native Americans far enough to the west, that they would be out of the path of any onrush of white people who wanted that land, and specifically the land they chose, which is now the state of Oklahoma, was chosen with the idea that it didn't have a lot of the obvious things in its contours and land and soil that would lead farmers to want to live there. It's very arid and doesn't have much obvious growing potential. So basically, they gave the Native Americans. So the idea of this law is they're going to give the Native Americans access to land that they thought no white people would ever want. Little did they know that just a handful of decades later, oil was discovered in Oklahoma, and suddenly a lot of white people want to move there after all. But that came later. So the Indian Removal Act, passed in 1830 with strong support from Andrew Jackson, gave the president the authority to sign new treaties with the tribes within the borders of the United States. The idea of those new treaties would be that the tribes, if they agree, and they're not required by the law, they're just strongly urged by the law, if they agree, then they will be removed by the federal government to that Indian territory west of the Mississippi River, and the government will help pay their expenses and make that happen. Now, there's also language in the Indian Removal Act that said that if tribes were not willing to negotiate to give up their land, the president could force them to. The president could use his authority as commander in chief and force Native American tribes who didn't agree to these treaties to be removed, as opposed to agreeing to remove themselves. And so Jackson, right after the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was passed, Jackson began to negotiate directly at first, and then eventually through other people in his administration, with the leaders of the 5 so-called civilized tribes. The 3 weakest of the tribes, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, and the Creeks, in the early years after the Indian Removal Act were passed, um, feeling that they had limited options, their leaders ultimately did sign these new treaties, and then the federal government was supposed to pay to help them move out of their ancestral lands. And you can just imagine how heartbreaking this is, and then go on, they don't have trains or airplanes or anything. This is a land voyage across what is now, half a dozen states to get to what's now Oklahoma. Those 3 tribes, starting in 1831 and scattered over the next few years, as their leaders signed these treaties with the government is supposed to help them move, and the army specifically is supposed to help them move. Um, but the army botched the job, and a lot of people died along the way because they're not only is it just incredibly difficult to move this many people all at once, uh, but they're going to places that they don't know where they are. They don't know what food there is. They don't, they can't grow anything because they have to be on the road. And so there's supposed to be food waiting for them at different way stations along the way. And the government had paid contractors to make food available. In many cases, these contractors just took the money and ran, or they were, corrupt, or they were not up to the job of feeding so many people. And so there was starvation along the way. People died of disease, and that's the tribes that were willing to go. Some of the Seminoles did leave. The Seminoles, of course, are in Florida, and most of the land that they are on is essentially the Everglades in the middle of Florida, which white people are still scared to go to, pretty much. Um, and some of the Seminoles agreed and so left around the same time with similar negative consequences for them on the journey. Others of them retreated inside the Everglades, and there is still a significant Native American presence in the interior of Florida. Basically, the government would have wanted to get the Seminoles out, but they are in an area that it's very difficult to dislodge them, and so they held on. A strange thing about Florida, though, is that then later on, the story sort of gets turned around, and so the Florida State football team, their mascot is the Seminoles, and so there's a guy who dresses up as a Native American who shows up at the beginning of every football game, and he rides around on a horse, and all the fans cheer, which is strange because they're cheering for a symbol of the culture that they try to destroy, but anyway, Americans are weird. Maybe Americans at football games are especially weird. Maybe we'll have football games again someday. Hey, that would be nice. All right. But really, the most important part of the story are the Cherokees, because the Cherokees are the Native American tribe that had assimilated the most. They are the tribe that had developed a lot of the same ideology and cultural traits as their neighbors. A lot of them had intermarried with white people, economically were more viable, and so were in a position to fight back because they had uh, different economic and political ties, and also had developed a cultural ideology that draws on some of the founding ideas of the government, which is republicanism. So the Cherokee people tried through legal and political means to stop this from happening. Um, they're up against basically 2 things, well, really 3 things. They're up against their neighbors, the white people who want their land, but governmentally, they're up against 2 things because the state of Georgia, which is the state that most of their land is in, the state of Georgia had passed a series of laws to make it difficult for the Cherokee people to continue to manage that land. And the Cherokees were trying to fight the state of Georgia, while at the same time, they see that the federal government has passed the Indian Removal Act, and they're doing their best to stop the treaty process and to stop Jackson from forcing them out. So the state government, and of course Jackson and the state government of Georgia see eye to eye on this. They both want the Cherokees out. The state government was the closest government to them, and the one that's laws were most interfering with their day-to-day activities. And so therefore, the Cherokee people, the most assimilated of these tribes, responded the way any American citizen would, when laws are passed to take their rights away, they went to court, showing how quote unquote civilized they were. They hired a lawyer. They got some help from missionaries from New England who were friends of theirs, who had been, supporting them in various other ways. And then they went to court and sued the state of Georgia and said, all these laws that you guys have passed to try to take away our access to our land and our property rights and so forth, these are a violation of our constitutional rights. And ultimately, that case, which is called Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, got to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled on it in 1831, so a year after the Indian Removal Act was passed. 1831, it turns out that John Marshall is still Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1831. He didn't make it much longer. In many ways, a man very much out of his time. He was a Federalist, for crying out loud. And in 1831, there's no Federalist left. Um, and Marshall still, as was the case back then, takes specific instances and then does something with them that you don't expect that has long-term lasting consequences, although the people involved in the case aren't always happy in the short run. Um, so, in the case of Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the Cherokee people had defined themselves as a separate nation, and they were suing the state of Georgia saying, your laws don't apply to us. And so they sued in federal courts, and ultimately it went to the Supreme Court. John Marshall wrote the decision that came down in 1831, and his response was that the Cherokee Nation lost. Specifically, what he said was the Cherokees, as Native Americans, are not citizens of the United States. And in fact, if you look at the Constitution, there's lots of reasons to justify that. So he is coming up with a status for them that fits a lot of the original constitutional ideas of Native Americans. So he says they're not citizens of the United States, and therefore they can't sue in federal court. They don't have standing, as it's called. You can't sue in a court that you don't actually sort of exist as a legal presence. So therefore they lost the case. However, Marshall said, let's think about what would have happened if they were citizens. Are they able to sue Georgia and to win their rights as an independent nation as they define themselves? And Marshall, in typical John Marshall fashion, said, no, it's more complicated than that because these Native American tribes are within the United States, and therefore the United States has responsibility toward them. So the federal government ultimately is going to be responsible for the welfare of these individual tribes based on their connections that we've had with them since the Constitution and earlier. So Marshall says in the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia decision that Native American tribes within the United States are defined not as separate independent nations, because that would give them their own sovereignty. He says instead, Native American tribes are what he calls domestic dependent nations. So they have sort of the status of nations, except that they're not independent nations. They're dependent nations within the United States, which is the overall nation they're a part of. They're domestic in the sense of they're within the United States. But the key thing in his explanation of the status is that as nations, as opposed to just individual people, they are engaged in diplomacy the same way, say, France or Germany would. Those are external, not domestic, and they're independent, not dependent, but they're nations. And government to government is how diplomacy happens, not state to government is the key thing here. And so Marshall says that although they didn't win the case, their overall point is correct, which is that the state governments have no jurisdiction over these individual domestic dependent nations, and instead only the federal government does. And so he implies that if they'd been able to have the standing to win the case, that he would have thrown out the Georgia state laws. And in fact, the following year, in a follow-up case, Marshall got one more chance to discuss this, where the Cherokee people got one of their missionary friends, who is a white citizen of the U.S., to sue the state of Georgia for some of these laws. And in the follow-up case, Marshall did throw out the Georgia laws that had been passed to interfere with the rights of the Cherokee people within the state of Georgia. So they got what they wanted in the long run. In the short run, in the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia decision, Marshall defined a new representation and a new connection between the Native American peoples, the Native American tribes, um, and the government, which is that only the federal government, not state governments, is going to be directly involved in the management and welfare of the Native American tribes. And that's the basis of Native American policy down to today, where the tribes have some sovereignty, some control over what's going to happen in the land that they control, not just sort of continuing their culture, but also making local laws, and to some extent, external laws do not apply the same way on reservations, on Native American reservations, as they do in the outside community. And then the federal government, and only the federal government, is going to negotiate with and to work in coordination with the leaders of those tribes for the overall welfare of the tribes. There's a branch of the federal government, it's called the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and it's in the Department of the Interior. And their job is supposed to be to make sure that the overall welfare of Native Americans is taken care of. It's not been very successful. At various times in the history of our country, that has been run quite shamefully, and there's been corruption and all kinds of other problems. One result is that Native Americans are among the poorest of all ethnic groups in this country. During our pandemic, on some of the reservations out west, there is a real crisis going on there because the health system is just so weak. Um, Many of the social ills that happen elsewhere in the country are just magnified among a lot of these Native American tribes, which is tragic. And the federal government has historically not done enough to support them, which is also tragic. However, um, there still is the possibility, at least, that this nation to nation, domestic dependent nation status could, under an administration that takes their needs more seriously, could help solve some of the problems. But today, if you're looking for poverty, the poorest parts of this country are still the places that have the highest percentage of Native Americans. Reservations that are, for the most part, out west, although there are still some Native American tribes that have control of some land, fairly small, in the eastern part of the country. So that's the policy of this. But what about the actual day to day ramifications of this? Because on the one hand, the Supreme Court seems to kind of be on the side of the Cherokees. On the other hand, it's not giving them exactly what they want. And maybe they're going to have some success against the state of Georgia. But what about on this overall national law, which is looming at them? The president is supporting this policy, which is trying to encourage them to be forced to move. Very few of the Cherokee people are interested in moving. They, of course, this is, as is the case with the other tribes, this is where they're from. This land belongs to them. It's been there since their ancestors. But also, they're dug in economically. They're dug in. They have made a case for for growing the things that were going to earn them money, and to be forced to move somewhere else is going to require them to start over. There's obviously a lot of unfairness in this, and they had been petitioning Congress and anyone else who would listen to them to listen to their side that this is not somewhere that they should be forced to leave. And so, because the Cherokees are holding out and using every possible method they can to put aside or to push off any kind of reckoning similar to what the other tribes had to deal with, ultimately Jackson left office with the question of what was going to happen to the Cherokees unresolved. It had been his goal to push the Cherokees out the way he pushed out the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and the Creeks, and to a smaller extent the Seminoles. But with the exception of just a handful of Cherokees, he had not been able to figure out a way to force them to sign the same kinds of treaties, giving up their land that the other, not as well positioned tribes had done. Which means that this Native American policy that he had initiated was left for his successor, Martin Van Buren, to deal with. Remember, Van Buren, this story is about Van Buren. Van Buren will pop up a lot. You're going to forget about him a few times, but he's coming back, I promise you. So, Van Buren came into office in 1837, and this Native American policy was one of the things that he had to deal with. And he tried one last time to talk the Cherokee leaders into signing treaties where they would agree to give up their land and move to the Indian Territory with these other tribes. When they refused in 1838, he implemented the second part of the Indian Removal Act, which gave him the authority, if the president felt it was necessary, which in this case he does, to use force. And specifically, what happened in 1838 was he authorized the army to go into the Cherokee territory to round up as many of those people as they could find. Somewhere between 16 and 18,000 Cherokee people were essentially just arrested, more or less, rounded up and put in a fenced-off area in a camp that the army then patrolled while they tried to collect everybody else. Conditions in that camp were very poor, unsanitary, not enough food, people are dying there. And then once they had everybody, or they thought they had everybody, then the army, at the point of a gun, marched all the Cherokee people out of their ancestral land, leaving forever, and then forced them at a forced march a third of the way across the country to modern-day Oklahoma. Between the camps and the march, somewhere between 2 to 4,000 of the Cherokee people died. Exact numbers not clear, but those numbers are clearly devastating just in terms of a percentage of the population and just the horror of having to live through it. The Cherokees, the survivors of this horrible experience of being forced by the government to give up their land, to have it completely confiscated, and to be forced at the point of a gun to go somewhere else and start over again. The Cherokees look back on this event, and especially on this terrible, terrible walk that they had to undergo, and they call it the Trail of Tears. 1838, the federal government took their land and forced them to walk to a new home, leaving behind their ancestral lands, leaving behind many people dead along the way. It's a terrible, horrible ripping out of the heart for the Cherokee people that they never forgot. And the Trail of Tears, which is specifically a Cherokee thing, ultimately is seen as sort of a metaphor for the overall bad treatment that the Native American peoples got throughout the 19th century from the federal government and from the army. It's a sad story. I will say that it seems sadder to us now than it seemed to most Americans at the time, which is a sign that times change and that people's understanding of cultural mores and things like that have developed, which is good. But at the time when Martin Van Buren did this, when Van Buren said, we're going to use the federal government, we're going to use the army, we're going to use force to make this change and to make the Native Americans of the Cherokee tribe leave where they had been for centuries and open it up to exploitation by the Georgians and other white people who came and took their land. When he did that, very few people objected. There had been some opponents of the Indian Removal Act when it passed in 1830, and there were some opponents of the Trail of Tears in 1838 when Van Buren used the army to do this, but there weren't a lot. There were some people who had been missionaries or in some other reasons opposed Jackson and Van Buren's plans to push the Native Americans out. But for the most part, this was a popular thing and strongly supported all throughout the country, north, south, east, and west. It's actually one of the few things that Van Buren did that was popular and broadly popular, which says a lot about the politics of the 1830s and about the cultural ideas of the 1830s. Today, we look back on this as a shameful moment in American history, but at the time, Van Buren took pride in it because he, in this case, was following Jackson's legacy to the letter, and he felt had succeeded where Jackson had not. All right, one other of the legacies of Andrew Jackson, one other particular issue that Jackson left behind is an issue that especially is of importance to Southerners, and that is going to be what to do about Texas. So, again, we're going to have to back up a little bit to get the context here. Texas in the 18 teens was a part of Mexico. Mexico became an independent country, pulled away from Spain as the Spanish Empire was collapsing, as all these republics were being created in the various revolutions in the early 1800s that we heard about in the context of the Monroe Doctrine. Mexico became an independent country in 1810. And then, as the newly independent country of Mexico began trying to develop itself economically, one of their concerns was that, if you remember, the old Spanish colonies had been fairly underdeveloped, farther away from Mexico City, farther away from the economic strength of the empire. So the parts of Mexico which are in what's now the United States, they were relatively underpopulated. Of course, there's Native American people living there and had been. But from the point of view of the Mexican government, it seemed to them that their outer fringes, their northern provinces, needed economic development, and they need people. And given Texas, which is the most northeastern of the Mexican provinces, borders on the United States, it touches parts of what is now places like Louisiana and so forth. Therefore, the Mexican government decided that if they want economic development in that part of their country, it would be smart for them to try to encourage Americans to come across the border into Texas. And so the Mexican government hired people to try to go into the United States and encourage Americans to move across the border into Mexico, where they could get good land, a lot of it, make good profits growing things on that land. All that you had to do if you want to get that land really at a song was you had to just become a Mexican citizen and promise to follow the laws of the new country of Mexico, which many did. Ultimately, by the mid 1830s, there's something like 36,000 former Americans living in Texas. They refer to themselves as Texians, which I think is cute. And they vastly outnumbered the actual Mexicans who are living in Texas. Something like 5,000 people of Mexican descent living in Texas, whereas the white former American Texians completely outnumbered those folks. And they are having economic success predicated on the ideas that they brought with them when they came from places like Louisiana and Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia and the Deep South. In other words, they bring with them the ideas of plantation agriculture and slavery. So those Texians have several thousand slaves who are doing a lot of the work on the plantations that's making the white Texians quite wealthy. The problem turns out to be, though, that in the late 1820s, things began to change in the relationship between Texas and the rest of Mexico. There were laws that were passed as the Mexican government just turned away from the idea of slavery, where the overall country of Mexico outlawed slavery in the late 1820s. They let Texas hold on to slavery as an exception, but they banned the import of future slaves. And in Texas, they got nervous that then soon Mexico would do the final step and would try to ban slavery in Texas as well. And then in the mid 1830s, there's a change in leadership in Mexico. Mexico's government was chronically unstable and was so for on and off for over a century. And not the last time this happened, but there was a coup, and the leader of the military, a general named Santa Anna, took over the government and tried to run Mexico sort of as a dictator. And one of his biggest concerns was looking at Texas because the Texians are clearly doing their own thing and don't really feel that connected to Mexico and are sort of ignoring a lot of what the Mexican laws are. And then, as he tried to get rid of slavery in Texas, the Texians basically said, no way. At which point, in 1836, Santa Anna decided it was time to show Texas that he was the boss. He's the general, he's the leader of the country, he sees himself as the boss in every possible way. And so at the very end of 1835, and especially in early 1836, at the head of thousands of troops, Santa Anna stormed into Texas to try to force the Texians to fully submit to his authority. And the Texians fought back against Santa Anna. They're angry at him. They're angry also in general at the policies of the Mexican government that they think are attacking their way of life. And especially at the center of this argument is the dispute over whether or not slavery could continue in Texas. At first, this does not go well for Texas. Santa Anna attacked the it's a town in those days, but now city of San Antonio. The Texians held out. They hide in an abandoned mission called the Alamo. And although they're surrounded by a much larger force of the Mexican army, they are able to take pot shots at the army that's surrounding them and cause a lot of casualties in the Mexican army until eventually they ran out of supplies. And then the army outside attacked, stormed the Alamo, and killed everybody inside. You can go to the Alamo and sort of see this place that is considered to be sort of the beginning of Texas independence. The martyrs at the Alamo are considered to be sort of the founding fathers of Texas, almost along the same lines as the Continental Congress or something for the United States, except that the Continental Congress didn't all get killed. Anyway, so while Santa Anna was taking over San Antonio and during the long siege of the Alamo, in the meantime, other Texians in the eastern part of the state had consolidated, and they even got some help from outside, and ultimately had pulled together a big enough force that they were able to fight more directly against General Santa Anna. And at a battle in a place called San Jacinto, a little bit later in 1836, this time the Texians won. And here's where it's a problem when the leader of your country is also the leader of the army. If you lose a battle, like the whole country is lost. So after San Jacinto, the leaders of Texas forced Santa Anna to allow Texas to be independent. Originally, that even wasn't their intention, but once the Mexican government attacked them, as they're fighting back, they are realizing that if they're going to survive, they have to go their separate ways and pull away from Texas. So ultimately, this becomes a revolution, and a successful Texas revolution, the result of which is by the middle of 1836, the Mexican government, theoretically at least, has allowed part of their country to pull away and to separate itself out and not be part of Texas, not be part of Mexico anymore. And Texas, therefore, becomes independent and declares itself an independent country. They define themselves in many ways similar to the United States because most of the Texians were from there. They define themselves as a republic. They're only one state, so their flag has one star on it, as opposed to the United States flag, which has as many stars as there are states, 13 the Betsy Ross flag, 50 today. The reason why the Cowboys have one star in their helmet is because Texas used to be the Lone Star state, used to be the Lone Star Republic, because there was just one of them. But this is all happening. The creation of a slave-owning, plantation-owning, mostly white Southerner-led revolution against Mexican control is happening in Texas in the last year of Andrew Jackson's rule. And you can guess who Andrew Jackson was rooting for. And Jackson is a Southerner. Jackson is a slave owner. Jackson doesn't really think very highly of Mexico. And Jackson likes the idea of Texas pulling away from Mexico, and further would like to hope, as many other white Southerners did, that Texas wouldn't just stay independent, but would join the United States and become a new state to be annexed, as the word is, into the United States. But that's too complicated for him to resolve while he's president. Even though white Southerners really want it to happen, it's not the sort of thing that can happen just by snapping your fingers. And so it just happened too late in his presidency for him to be able to resolve. So this is going to be left as the third major issue for Martin Van Buren to try to figure out a solution to while he's president. Panic of 1837 could never find a solution. Indian removal policy, he found a solution that today turns our stomach, but at the time was popular. Texas, though, Texas he couldn't find a solution because any solution he came up with would make somebody in his country mad. Southerners desperately wanted Texas. Southerners saw this land, the possibilities of plantation agriculture there. They saw that culturally, the Texians are all supporters of slavery, and so they saw this as an opportunity to expand their part of the country. But the North, for their part, was worried that if Texas got added as a big slave state, or who knows, it's pretty big. It could even have been more than one state in theory. If that got added as a slave state, it would upset that balance between slave and free states that had been the legacy of the Missouri Compromise. And what Northerners are very concerned about is that this may not be the end of it, but that if we let Texas in as a state and then add to the slave states and add to the South, that eventually the South will continue expanding and this balance will shift and the North will start to lose out. So Northerners did their best to stop Texas from being annexed. Van Buren, as president, didn't know who to make happy because, on the one hand, his party, the Democrats, are the party of the South and of the West, and therefore his party wants Texas. But Van Buren was worried that if he supported the annexation of Texas, he would lose all support in the North, and the North was where the Panic of 1837 was having the worst effects. So he was incredibly unpopular up north and was worried that if he gave the South what they want, which is Texas, that he would never get any votes ever in the North. And so, therefore, as a way to not lose votes in either part of the country, he essentially did his best to put off any decision about Texas all through his administration. So he didn't say yes, he didn't say no, he just doesn't really do anything about it, which doesn't satisfy anybody, and kicks the can of this particular issue down the road. So in this one, he didn't do anything. But in every other possible way, even though he is from the North, in every other possible way, Van Buren made sure that he favored the South on any issue related to slavery. So he doesn't give them Texas, but he does give them everything else in all the other issues that came up during his presidency. If there's an issue that relates to slavery or any issue where the North and the South are bickering, Van Buren as president always comes down on the side of the South and always makes decisions that support the existence of slavery, even though he's from the North, because his party is strong in the South and he needs their support. So there's a number of policies and administration decisions that happened during his presidency where he shows how pro-Southern he is in hopes of getting Southern votes when it's going to be time for him to run for re-election. So on that one, he did make a decision. He holds on to that legacy. This isn't the end of the story of Texas, which is going to come up again later tonight, and then we'll finally resolve that story in a future lecture. But we'll see how it affects Van Buren a little bit later, because first I need to take a long, long diversion. You thought the Indian story was long. A long diversion into economics, which is going to come back to Martin Van Buren eventually. Basically, I need to, at some point in these set of lectures, I need to talk about some important economic changes that are happening in the same Jacksonian era. And this is where I do it because I can connect it to Martin Van Buren. It could stand on its own. Could be a little economic lecture, and Lord knows if you don't even listen to that one. But anyway, there's some important economic changes that are going on in this general time period that we need to understand if we're going to move forward. So here's what we do. Okay, so you probably, if you have any knowledge of the history of the world, you probably have heard of the Industrial Revolution, which is a big set of economic changes that started in England in the 1700s and eventually expanded throughout much of the world. This is not that. The Industrial Revolution is about machinery and it's about the use of power. It's about the expansion of marketplaces and all kinds of big changes. Factories, those are the things that you think of when you think of the Industrial Revolution, eventually thinking of Henry Ford and automobile manufacturing, and who knows what else. So that's coming later. For the US, they will eventually become a major industrial country, but that's farther down the line. At this point, and the changes I'll be talking about are broadly speaking the first half of the 1800s, because economic change never happens just by snapping your fingers. It tends to be more evolutionary. These changes are going to be important predecessors to the industrialization of the country, which will largely happen after the Civil War and will take off in a big way as the U.S., by the turn of the 20th century, will be the most industrialized country in the world. Um, these are important initial steps, and it turns out they're going to be interlocking because as one starts, then it sets in motion another one, which then sets in motion another one, and they all work together to help make the possibility of some other economic changes that are better known. But these are all still pretty much a big deal, especially for people who live through them. So the first important change, the first big economic change, is what historians call the transportation revolution. Um, what's happening in the first part of the 1800s is a series of individual, sometimes local decisions that eventually create a network of transportation that by the middle of the century has made the United States much more tied together with big long-term ramifications. So you go back to Henry Clay and the American system, but really go back even further than that, and think about the way the country was connected together. It's a big country, especially after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. This is a very large country, and yet it is really not tied together at all because transportation between different regions is almost impossible. Basically, what you have available for you is you can walk, which isn't going to get you very far. You can ride a horse, but although horses can go pretty fast, they have to stop every now and then, and they have to get some water and drink and sleep and so forth. They can pull wagons and things like that, but they're still limited by how far their actual bodies can go. More efficient for long distance travel is something on the water. So you can go down a river, and that can be pretty fast. But what if you want to go up the river? Um, Not until the invention of the steamboat in 1807 is it actually possible to have a ship go up a river against the current. And the early steamboats, the technology takes a while to work out particularly well. They blow up a lot, so it's not really the safest thing. But still, steamboats are going to make transportation up the river, opposite to the current, something feasible. But that is going to work where there are rivers already existing. So if you're going to connect the country together, leaders of the country need to figure out ways to get around the limitations of what nature has already created. So one thing you can do is you build roads. And in the colonial days, in the early part of the 1800s, there were roads that were being constructed by local businesses, by state governments, and then by the federal government. The national road, which is one of the ideas of the American system, was being constructed piece by piece from the East Coast through the Appalachians, and then eventually it's going to get all the way to basically to the Mississippi River, although that took a long time. Um, Building a road that actually you know where it goes, that you can find on a map, um, is a stupidly successful idea because in those days most people had never traveled more than like 20 miles from where they were born. They don't know where they are most of the time. There aren't signs anywhere. And so you're riding around on your horse and you get to an intersection, some crossroads, and you're not sure if you go this way, if you're going to wind up just sort of in the middle of the hills or in the middle of some farmer's backyard, or it's going to take you into the next town. Maps basically don't exist. Of course, there's no GPS. Um, so most people travel is very difficult. And when the federal government and then private companies begin to build roads that take people places that you know where it is and where it's going, um, that's a big change. But also for water transportation, it's great if you have a river already because rivers allow you to transport goods. If you've got a barge or one of these early steamboats or whatever, Um, but what if you want to connect places that don't have water connecting them? Well, the traditional solution to that, and this goes back to ancient times, the ancient Romans had these, and the ancient Egyptians had these, and ancient China had these, is basically build your own river, which is a canal. A canal is just a man-made, human-made waterway that connects different places together. And then it's shallow and not too wide, but it's wide enough that you can float barges on it. And therefore, you can transport people, but most importantly, you can transport things quickly-ish and cheaply-ish, and much more efficiently than you can if you sort of load on the back of a horse. So canals have been built in the colonial days, but canal building really took off in the United States after 1825. In the 1820s, the state of New York decided that they were going to pay for the construction of a canal across the middle of the state, sort of upstate New York. The idea of this canal would be that it would connect the Hudson River, which is a naturally existing thing, and we've heard about since the early founding of New York back in the Dutch days. That river is incredibly useful, but it only goes so far. The canal is going to go cut across the middle of New York from the Hudson River all the way to the Great Lakes. And the other states made fun of the New Yorkers for spending such incredible amounts of money on the Erie Canal until the Erie Canal opened in 1825 and did amazing business. Because it turns out that once the canal was opened, that many business people, farmers and shippers and merchants, want to take advantage of this waterway, which connects basically the whole Great Lakes region through water, which is an inexpensive and efficient way to transport goods, all the way down to the eastern seaboard. So after the Erie Canal opened up, farmers in a place like Detroit, Michigan, who were growing grains or whatever, previously they could have only sold that stuff to people that they could get to, in a cart or whatever. Now they can put them on barges and they can ship that stuff through the Great Lakes, across the Erie Canal, down the Hudson River to New York City, and then from there get on a ship and sell it all over the world. And suddenly, the whole basically upper Midwest has access to markets that they've never had access to before. All of those people are going to now be able to grow more things or produce more things and sell them and make money on it. And the upper Midwest expands dramatically after the Erie Canal is opened up because there's business that can be done there because they can get access to where everybody else lives. All that stuff goes through New York, through the canal that the state of New York built, and then ultimately through New York City, which is already one of the most important ports in the country. And suddenly, the state of New York and the city of New York just blew up economically because so much business is coming through their state and through their important port city. And the success of the Erie Canal made all the other parts of the country realize, oh man, we should have one of those too. In the aftermath of the Erie Canal success, there were lots of other canals that were constructed in other parts of the country hoping to duplicate that kind of success, to sort of connect up their city or their town with other farmers or other merchants or whatever. And there's a canal building explosion in the 1820s and 30s, the result of which is that there's sort of a loose network of canals that are built all over the country, especially in the Northeast, where there's capital and where there's interest in this sort of thing. One example locally, which didn't have the kind of success that the Erie Canal did, but a bunch of investors in Washington, D.C. thought if we could build a canal that will connect our city, which is a port city basically, connects to the Potomac River and from there to the Chesapeake, if we can build a canal that connects our city through the mountains that are not too far to the west and then get into the Ohio River Valley, then we would have a network that would bring farmers and their goods from kind of the central Midwest coming through DC. And they thought DC would explode economically the same way the Erie Canal had made New York City explode economically. Well, they didn't have the same kind of success. The investors ran out of money before they got as far as they wanted. And their timing wasn't very good because by the time they're thinking of this, it turns out that there was another local competitor that came up with a different idea that was more successful. And in the long run, the C&O Canal, as it's called, for Chesapeake and Ohio, named after the things it was supposed to connect, the C&O Canal didn't really work out. And much later down the line, the remnants of it were taken over by the federal government, and now it's a national park, which of course you can go explore on and enjoy. And it's nice that it exists, but it was a failure. But it's part of an overall process of building canals that was something that was happening all over the country. And I said the C&O canals, part of their failure is that there was a local regional competitor that beat them at their game, and that is the railroad. Another kind of transportation that took off in a big way, starting in a tiny way in the 1830s, but really 1840s and just exploded in the 1850s, was the railroad. Railroad was a transportation technology that the British instituted as they were trying to figure out ways to bring coal from the coal mining areas to the manufacturing areas in other parts of the country. And so they came up with the early ideas of the technology. The beautiful thing about the railroad is that although it's expensive to build, once it exists, it's relatively inexpensive to maintain, and the speeds and distances traveled are much faster than any other kind of transportation that existed at that point. And so once the British began to successfully build railroads and to show that the technology was useful, then the US began to pick up on it as well. The most successful early example of that was based out of Baltimore. I said the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal was trying to connect the Chesapeake area with the Ohio River Valley by canals. Well, the B&O Railroad, which if you play Monopoly will sound familiar, the B&O Railroad, their idea was to connect Baltimore and their part of the Chesapeake by railroad through the mountains not too far to the west, and then from there into the interior of the Ohio River Valley. By the early 1840s, the B&O Canal, their investors had succeeded in building a route that got them far enough they began to make money, and they were an early example of how this would be useful for the U.S. The British did it first, but their country is tiny in comparison to the United States. The U.S., if they can build railroads, can connect people thousands of miles away from each other, and ultimately that's what started to happen as businesses, mostly businesses, a little bit of government subsidy, began to lay down track mileage by the tens of thousands of miles ultimately, which had the effect of opening up and connecting different parts of the country together. So you put all these things together. You have just basic road construction. You have the invention of the steamboat, which makes two-way travel on the rivers possible. Then you have canals, which are basically invent your own rivers. And then you have railroads, which are what do we need rivers for? We can have things with wheels, and steam power, which is going to generate, transportation mileage and speed and so forth. Put all those together and then look at the maps of how much of this is happening all over the country. And that's why historians say that the US had a transportation revolution in the first half of the 1800s. Because that network that didn't exist at the beginning of the 1800s, that does exist by the middle of the 1800s, means that the country is connected in ways that it previously had never been. Whereas previously, people did business locally, whereas previously, people wouldn't think about being able to travel any farther than they could ride on a horse. Now it is possible, and that means that the country is connected together and can link up and think of itself as connected in a way that previously it hadn't. So, some ways that this plays out. Just simple transportation. The trip from Cincinnati, Ohio to New York City in the early 1800s was a trip that would take probably about 10 weeks, which is fascinating to think about. But if you're basically riding on a horse, you can only go so far as the horse can go on any given day, and you can stop for the night. And so obviously that kind of travel was expensive, not something that people would do more than once in their lifetime. If you live in New York and you move into Ohio, you're never coming back probably because it can't do that more than once. You can communicate with your old friends and family back home by letter, but you may never see them again. After this network of roads, canals, and railroads all gets put together, by the mid of the century, that's a trip that can take 5 days. Now, of course, by our standards, 5 days from Cincinnati to New York is really nothing to speak about because, of course, you can drive, and if you really want to, you could fly, and you can get there a lot faster than in 5 days. But compared to what it had been in a person's lifetime in the mid 1800s, that 5 day trip from Cincinnati, Ohio, in the middle of the country to New York City on the coast, one of the most important cities on the coast, that's a thinkable trip. That's a possible trip. You can go back and forth that way. You can communicate that way. You can do all kinds of things that way. You can do business that way. And therefore, that part of the interior of the country and that part of the coastal, more populous part of the country, they are connected in ways that other parts of the country are also being connected and being able to do business with each other and communicate with each other and work together in a relatively time sensitive fashion, in an efficient fashion. That's all happening. It's going to help make this country get united because economically they are no longer separate little entities in their own local regions. That also means that people are able to buy things from places where it's made cheaper. This is especially true for food. The more populated East Coast, so the cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, previously food was very expensive in those cities. The cost of living was very expensive there because it's very expensive. The land is expensive there, and therefore any crops that are grown locally are going to cost a lot of money. But there's places farther out west, whether that's farther out of Pennsylvania or maybe across into the interior of the country, where it is cheaper to grow things. But before the transportation revolution, that food could never have gotten to the East Coast cities before it spoiled or just was too expensive to transport. But once the transportation revolution happens, once this network of roads and canals and railroads exists, it is possible to have things grown where it is cheap to grow them and then inexpensively transmit it to the more populated parts of the country and sell it there. That's a thinkable thing, which means that the cost of a lot of food is going to drop dramatically, which means that the overall cost of living is going to drop dramatically because the transportation makes it possible to get it from where it's cheap to the places where there's a lot of people who need it. An example is the cost of a barrel of flour, which is, of course, a key element in making bread, key staple. The cost of a barrel of flour went down to a sixth of its previous cost in about 30 years between 1820 and 1850 in the city of New York. So whereas previously that was a luxury item and bread was something that a lot of people just couldn't afford, that only the wealthy people could afford, now it's going to be inexpensively available because the bakers of New York can buy flour inexpensively and then sell it inexpensively to the masses. And that is one of many examples that starts to happen where the cost of transportation is relatively small. Once the network exists, then some people are just making a little bit on every shipment across it. That adds up, and so eventually, the people who are making it are going to make some money by selling it eventually to the marketplace where there's people who are desperate for it and can afford it now because it's coming from somewhere that's cheaper to make it, and it doesn't have this extra markup of all the extra transportation costs. So overall, the transportation revolution is going to expand the standard of living. And that in itself makes it a very significant and very important part of people's lives as they live through it. Now, the transportation revolution wasn't exactly evenly distributed. Um, the maps of the US and its roads, canals, and railroads will show that much more of the transportation network was developed north of the Mason-Dixon line and in the northern states. And that has a lot to do with the fact that the economies of the North were already a little bit more diversified. There's more capital available in the North, and therefore they experimented with some of these early technologies and were able to take advantage of it as it helped lead to other economic changes that worked for some northern businesses. Um, in contrast, the South really didn't do nearly as much of this sort of transportation network. They have a lot of useful rivers, especially the Mississippi and other rivers, that they can use to transport bulk goods. And so they didn't really think that they necessarily needed it. But also, people who have money to invest in the South are not likely to invest it in that time in something like a canal or a railroad or anything like that, because the South's economy is based on plantations and slavery. And therefore, the wealthy people in the South are not likely to put together a railroad business or a canal business or something like that. Instead, they're going to try to figure out a way to get more land so they can grow more cotton or whatever else they're growing on their plantations. And so this is one of the ways that Hayne and Webster are arguing, and Webster was right, that the North was pulling away from the South because it's investing in these transportation technologies, and the South was not. And then, therefore, the North is getting some of the results of these changes, and the South really was not. And that leads to one of the big changes that happens as a result of this transportation revolution, which is that in the parts of the country where the transportation revolution takes place, suddenly they are not isolated anymore. So if you look at the way the world worked, really the pre-modern world dating back to as long as you can think about civilization, since the time when there were towns and villages and agriculture and people start to settle down, there was a certain way that most communities worked. The exception would be once you start to have some big cities or places that specialize, but for the most part, where everybody lives, and this is going to be true in the colonial days in the Americas and through the early days of the United States, most people live in small towns. Most people, there are farmers, and then in that town are the people who sort of support the farmers. And they're all fairly local because transportation outside of their community just isn't possible. You can leave, but if you're leaving, you better plan to bring yourself a lot of food or some money to pay for, lodging with at an inn along the way or whatever, because to go farther than from Rockville to Germantown would be an almost unthinkable travel. And most people, they may leave, but they're traveling to go find new land. But if they're staying and then they want to travel, they're never going to go more than like 20 miles from where they live. So, in the days before the transportation revolution, in the days before this network of roads, canals, and railroads opened up, most people live in small towns where most of the economy is based on the same kind of traditional way of living that dates back thousands of years, pretty much a similar way of living as you could see in ancient China and ancient Africa, ancient Europe, going back to, you name it. And so most people lived these small local lives where interactions are face to face. You only do business because you only can do business with the people in your community, the people that you know, your neighbors, the people who, are within a walk or a short horse ride to. Those are the people that's the whole world, and that's therefore the whole economy. All business is local in the pre-modern days. Everybody does business with the people that they already know. These are face-to-face exchanges between people who already know each other. So, thinking about the stuff that's made in that community, if you've got a shoemaker or a carpenter or a cobbler or something like that, that person, they're only going to have customers in their community. They're only going to serve people that they know. The idea that they would have customers farther away outside of town, what would be the point? How would they even know those people need them? And those people have their own cobbler in their own town or their own shoemaker in their own town. And the cost of shipping something farther away than you could ride in a quick horse ride would be astronomical and unthinkable. So things that are being made by your local whatever, the person who you buy stuff from, the artisan is what they're called, the person with a skill who you come to when you need stuff, those things are all done locally. They're all face-to-face interactions with people who know each other. And given that most of the customers of the artisans, whether they're going to the cooper because they need a new barrel, or whether they're going to a carpenter because they need some work done on their roof, whether they're going to the shoemaker because they need new boots, or whatever it might be, uh, these things are all being done by people who know each other, which is important because the farmers who are doing most of the buying, they don't have any money. The life of a farmer is that you spend most of your year in debt, borrowing or promising that you'll pay eventually because they only make money once a year. They're growing things the whole year, and then that thing gets grown and it gets harvested, and then they sell that and they make money off of that, and they start working toward the next year. In the fall, when your harvest comes in, then you have money, but usually as a farmer, you have to then pay off all your debts. So most of the time, most of these interactions, therefore, are done sort of as promises, and they're done as interactions between people who know each other, and they're doing what's called barter. Barter is an agreement between people who know each other to come up with a fair exchange. Okay, so if you're a farmer and you need new shoes from the local shoemaker, but you don't have any cash because you're a farmer and only have cash in the fall, but you need new shoes now, then you're going to talk to the shoemaker and say, well, when I do have money later, here's how much I can pay you for it. And the shoemaker will say, well, I'm not sure it's worth me doing it for that much. And they'll haggle that. Or they might come up with another means of payment because maybe the farmer's not going to have a good year. Or maybe the shoemaker doesn't want to wait that long. So instead, they might come up with a trade. Well, if I make a pair of shoes for you, in the meantime, maybe you can help me fix my roof. Or maybe we can promise that when your wheat harvest comes in, you'll give me, grind it up and turn it into a barrel of flour. And then they haggle on that and they come up with what seems like a reasonable exchange based on what these two people know about each other. If the farmer knows that the shoemaker does a really good job, then they will probably come up with something that they think is pretty valuable in trade. If the shoemaker, who is the only shoemaker in town, is not very good at their job, they're old or they're drunk all the time or they're not well trained or whatever, then you'll probably say, well, maybe I'll give you half a barrel of flour or, throw in an extra pair of shoes to be worth that barrel of flour or whatever. They're negotiating based on what they know about each other and what they have to trade with each other, which means that every exchange is different. You can make the same product over and over again if you are one of these town artisans, but every time you sell it, even to the same person year after year, you're coming up with a different exchange that both of them agree on as fair in that moment. And then when the product is made or when it comes in or whatever, then they have to try to make sure that they get that payment. All these local interactions, this barter system, are based on their knowledge of each other, their relationship with each other, their sense of each other, what they can afford, and they're all different. That's the key thing. It's all contingent on the moment. It's based on what sort of both of them, both parties in the deal, what they agree is a fair trade. It's going to be different every time. So that's how things had always worked. And it works to the advantage of the artisan, the person who makes stuff, because they don't have any competition. If you're the worst shoemaker in the city, you're the only shoemaker in the city. It doesn't matter. People still have to come to you. You don't have to worry about any competition. You don't have to worry about your customers going somewhere else to find a better shoe or a cheaper shoe because that's not even thinkable. The way businesses work is that, with the exception of the big cities, where New York or Philadelphia would be an exception, but in a town like Rockville or a town like Germantown or something like that, There is no competition. These are what are called captured markets. The person who makes the products that the people in the town need, they're the only one in town. And therefore, they can basically set the price because no one else can get it from, you can't get it from anybody else. And people have these skills are very important to their community. They have a fairly high status. The prices that they're getting are going to help them live a pretty good lifestyle um, because they are offering products and services the people in their community are going to need on a regular basis. And therefore, they're going to keep getting whatever it is, whether it's money or the food or other things that are being bartered. Um, if you have this kind of skill, you are an important member of your community with a relatively high status because you don't have any competition. It's a captured market. Now, the other thing to understand about how the old system, the barter system, worked is that people who have these skills, so you're a cooper and you make barrels, or you're a shoemaker and you're the local, you sell shoes, or um, you're a blacksmith and you make horseshoes for the horses, or whatever. Um, those people don't make stuff and leave it lying around to sell to customers. People who want to buy things from the artisans don't go and browse the way one might do in a store when the store is open again, or online. It didn't exist back then at all, but you wouldn't do that. Instead, what you do is you have a need for something, and then you go to the person who can make it or provide the service, and then you negotiate then, and then that person says, okay, we've agreed on a price. Now I will make it for you or produce it for you. Um, which means that since the individuals who are making the product, whichever example it is, whatever kind of artisan, they don't need a lot of people working for them because they have business every now and then from customers who they're going to tell, come back in a week or 6 weeks or whatever. The product will be done then, and I'll send you a message that it's done or whatever. They don't have to lay in extra inventory. They make things as customers need them. They don't need to have a lot of stuff lying around to sell or a lot of the things that they turn into their product lying around. And therefore, their workplaces will be very small. It's not necessary for most artisans to have a big staff because mostly they're going to do the work themselves. They may have someone who they're training, an apprentice, who's going to help out. If they have a lot of business, if the town is a little bit bigger, they may have someone working with them who they've trained, who's living with them until that person is able to go off and sort of start for themselves somewhere. But for the most part, what we're talking about is tiny little workplaces that don't have a big staff. They're basically, if you're the shoemaker, you're the shoemaker. That's you. If you're the cooper, you're the cooper. That's you. And maybe your son or maybe some other apprentice is helping out. But these are very simple establishments because they're not making in high volume, and therefore most of these workplaces are either connected to the home or they're even part of the home. So if you're looking to buy shoes from the shoemaker in town, you ride to their house and you knock on the door, and then the shoemaker invites you into the kitchen and you negotiate there. And then after that's done, then the shoemaker says, all right, come back in a week, and then goes off to their workplace, which is connected to the house or maybe out back from the house, and works on it there in what is a pretty small scale enterprise, but they don't have that many customers, so they don't need anything bigger than that. They don't need to have a lot of people working for them. They don't need to have a big place or a workshop because they just don't have that much business. That's how it's done in these local towns. Okay? So that's how the world works. And that's how it had worked. That's how people are used to it working. The exceptions are going to be your big cities where the economy is more diversified and where there is more competition. Um, but for most people living in the small towns that represent most of America and really had represented most of civilization for thousands of years, that's the way people lived. But then the railroad comes to town, or the canal comes to town, or one of these big roads is built that goes by your town. And suddenly, as the transportation revolution connects your little town to other little towns, to the bigger world, Suddenly, when the transportation revolution opens up possibilities, it makes it possible for that town to do business with people farther away. And when that happens, the economy in that town changes. And this is happening in all sorts of parts of the country. Little towns all over the place are suddenly linked up together, linked up to the big city, linked up to each other, linked up to the places where other people live. And suddenly, as the transportation revolution, as it opens up into whatever part of the country where a new railroad or a new canal is built, then suddenly those places aren't so isolated anymore. Because once there's a railroad you have access to, or once there's a canal, or maybe the river has a steamboat on it, or whatever, once that happens in your community, then business doesn't have to just be local. It is possible for people in one town to produce things and sell to customers farther away, which also means it's possible for customers in your town to buy stuff from producers farther away. And when that happens, when people are not just doing face to face local communication, they're changing economics and changing their interactions as part of what we call the market revolution. Because people are not just buying in face to face interactions where they're bartering, instead, they're selling on the open market, or they're finding someone who can produce things and sell it to them through the open market. And that market is a much bigger world where people are connected in a much greater distance, where stuff can be maybe made cheaper. So, once the transportation revolution comes to your town and you are connected to wherever it may be, then suddenly these economic interactions locally are going to change. They're not just face to face interactions. People can buy stuff from producers farther away. People can sell stuff to consumers farther away. You're not going to know your customer. You're still going to know your local customers, but you can have customers who are 10 towns away or 100 towns away. And the transportation network is going to bring your product to them. You're going to drop off your box of shoes that are then going to get shipped on the canal all the way down the canal to some town that you can find on a map but have never heard of, but that's where somebody has a consignment to buy it. Or you're going to put it on a railroad and you're going to ship it 2 states away because that's where somebody is going to buy it. Because you're not going to know the person you're doing business with, because you have to then pay for the transportation of it, because it's going to go through a lot of middlemen, the only way that's going to work is if you have some sort of efficient means of payment. You can't have each one of those communications being done by the barter system. It can't be a haggle. It can't be a, well, this is how much I can pay you. This will never work that way. If the people all engage in this commerce are going to be essentially strangers to each other, then the only way they can do business together is if they have a means of exchange that they all agree on what it's worth. And what that means is cash. Cash is necessary for a more open ended business world where you're engaged in the marketplace in business transactions with people who are anonymous. You need to be able to all agree on how much stuff is worth, and then you can do business with them, including people that you'll never see, because you've got something that you all agree this is what it's worth. $1 here is $1 there is $1 here, and we can agree locally that $1 is worth this much of this thing, $1 is worth that much of that thing, $1 is worth shipping this thing, or whatever. Cash, this impersonal means of exchange, becomes incredibly important as you move away from the local personal barter system and into the market economy that's necessitated by the transportation revolution. People who can earn cash suddenly become much more important, as opposed to the people who really don't produce cash, or maybe only produce cash part of the year. The barter system is still happening in each of these local communities, But the people who can produce cash with the things that they're doing, they have much more flexibility, they can buy more stuff, and they have a higher status. And people who are just engaged in the barter system in their community, they're going to become a little more invisible. They're going to become a lot less important. All right, well, what about our friend, the artisan, the person who made the stuff? That person may still make stuff, but they no longer have the same kind of status because now they're competing for their customers, not just in their community. They're competing with all the places those customers can get stuff from. If you're the shoemaker in town and you're used to charging whatever you want, but then all your customers can get the same thing from some other town for cheaper, you're going to lose their business or you're going to cut your rates. You have to compete against the entire marketplace to keep your customers, which means the prices are going to go down. That's good news for the customers. That's good news for most people's standard of living. Stuff that used to be more expensive is now possible to get if you can find a cheaper place to get it from. And that means that more people will be able to afford to buy more things because competition leads to lower prices, and that's generally a good thing. But it's bad for the artisans. The artisans are used to charging whatever they wanted. The artisans are used to having a certain amount of status in their community. Now they are competing against everybody who makes the same things that they make. The only way they can keep that business is by lowering their costs, by accepting lower standard of living, by competing successfully against forces that they don't see, that are completely invisible. It's a little scary. It's good for most people who are consumers. It's bad for producers because each of them is going to have to compete against the other one in order to stay in business. And some of them are not going to succeed. Now, as it turns out, as the economics of the transportation revolution lead to the market revolution, and as people are looking for customers to buy more of their goods, and as consumers are looking for cheaper goods, some people began to realize that the solution was to produce as many of something, specialize in a thing, make a lot of it, and then find a lot of customers for it. And that meant the beginning of what we think of as factories, where goods or services are produced on a larger scale for more customers for cheaper prices because it's cheaper to do 10 of the same thing in one place than to do one of the same thing in 10 places. So, what if you ever take economics, you'll learn of as economies of scale, which is that once you basically pay your rent and pay for your equipment, then at that point, doing the same thing over and over again makes individual costs of your product cheaper. Therefore, that is a smart thing to do as the market revolution starts to happen. Some people in each of these industries realized that that was where business was going, and they began to change the way the work was being produced. So you have people who know how to make, say, a shoe. And instead of them just making the shoe themselves, then they hired other people to make more shoes. And then their job is to just find customers. And then they have to advertise or figure out some way to get to the customer, to let the customer know that they can make this product. Ultimately, what starts to happen is that some people begin to have larger scale enterprises where they hire people to make more of their product and then sell that, and they make a profit on each of the work that the individual people they hire. That can't happen in the house. If the market revolution is going to make this change happen as you have larger workplaces, those are not going to be those tiny little workshops connected to the house. Instead, the workplace is going to be disconnected from the house. Places where products are made. The farm is still the farm, but other things. So places where shoes are made, places where guns are made, places where clothing is sewn. That's not just going to be done in the little locality, in the back room of somebody's house. Instead, there's going to be a lot of people all working together working for somebody who then hires them to do the work, who then is going to sell a lot of that product. And that means that that kind of work is going to be offsite, whether it's in a factory, the place where a lot of people are manufacturing it and selling it on the market, or there's going to be offices which will manage that work who aren't going to even be directly doing it, but as it gets more complicated, you'll need more people to help coordinate that kind of an effort. So what starts to happen is there are places in the country that will specialize in making certain kinds of products, whether they are the places where factory owners first came up with this idea and then built the factories and hired the people who do the work, or places where they have the right natural resources, or they've got access to power, or whatever it may be. Um, some places specialize in producing particular goods, and then they try to sell them to as many of the rest of the country as possible, because the transportation network makes that happen. So the North, in particular, is going to have these changes of the market revolution take place there first, because the transportation revolution happened there first. They already had some manufacturing dating back to the days around the revolution and afterwards. Now, early investors, early capitalists, people with skills in some of these trades who realize that there is more money to be made hiring other people to make a lot of the product and sell in the market, they tend to be in the North, New England, New York and New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Those places are where the beginning of the market revolution in the United States really takes off, because those are the places where the transportation network had been built first. But everywhere in the country, this is a change that is happening, and you can live through this change in a lifetime. You can live through the change from a little town like Rockville being just a tiny little courthouse town surrounded by farms. And if you need something, you go into town and you find that person who can do it for you and pay them to do it, and they have your business. To, by the end of your lifetime, sending away for the product inexpensively, being produced by people who you never see, who may be making it many states away. People in Maryland who are buying shoes, many of them are buying shoes that are made in Massachusetts, where there are many shoemakers, or people in Germantown who are buying clothes. Many of them are buying clothes that are being made up in New England in a place like Connecticut, uh, where a lot of the early textile factories are being created. A lot of these early small scale, but much larger than what they had been before, these early small scale factories, they're up in New England where there is capital and where this transportation network is happening. And those people in those towns, their lives are very different than they had been just a little while earlier. So, this transportation network leads to this market revolution, which leads to an explosion in a lot of products that are available. The standard of living for many people goes up, but the standard of living for people who work with their hands goes down considerably. Because in a competitive marketplace, if you're going to sell a lot of your product, you need to sell it for as cheaply as possible. You're not just competing against the people in your town, you're competing for the business of everybody everywhere who are all looking for the cheapest possible product, and you've got to make a better product and cheaper than the other companies who might be trying to sell that product to those same customers. So, early entrepreneurs, early investors, early capitalists who are developing the early stages of the factory system that grows out of the market economy, they realized that a key thing they needed to do was to keep down the cost of their labor. In the early days, those early factories, whether it's people who are making guns, or people who are making pots, or people who are making textiles, or whatever, um, in the early days, they tended to hire people who had the skills to make whatever the product was. So if you're starting, let's say, a shoe factory, um, and you know you're going to have to hire, say, a dozen people to get you started, the people they're going to hire at first are going to be other shoemakers who expect to be well paid because they have learned a skill that is valuable, and it has been valuable historically to be able to have that skill that no one else has. But as these entrepreneurs begin thinking about expanding and about competing, they realized that if they could figure out a way to pay the employees less, then they could charge less to their customers and sell more of their product and make more money. Which means they don't want to hire skilled people who know how to make the product. Instead, what they want to do is figure out a way to make the product without the skill. And so, what starts to happen in New England and the mid Atlantic states, in the places where the market revolution is taking off, early entrepreneurs in early factories, what they realize is that they should each focus on making one kind of one product. So, not have a shoe factory, but have a shoe factory that makes moccasins, or a shoe factory that makes sneakers, not that those existed, or whatever. Something that's specialized, that's specific to what you think you're going to have a market for, and then take the process of making one of those and make each step as simple as possible. So, look at your shoes. I'm wearing shoes. I don't know why I'm wearing shoes. I'm sitting down in the basement minding my own business. I could be barefoot, but whatever. I'm wearing shoes. I assume that with the proper training and with all the tools and the raw materials, that I could be taught how to make one of the shoes that I'm wearing. But why bother to teach me how to make the whole shoe? Be much easier and smarter to get 10 people in the room and teach each one of them how to do one step in making the shoe. Why would you want to train somebody who knows all the steps in making the shoe? The cheaper way to do it is to teach one person how to cut the leather, and another person how to cut the eye holes, and another person how to sew the parts together, and another person how to tap on the sole so it doesn't fall off, and another person how to stitch in the shoelaces. Each of those steps is easy to train. Each of those steps doesn't take that long to learn. In each of those steps, the person who knows how to do it can be replaced very easily. Because they can replace very easily, because they don't have much of a skill, they don't have to be paid that much. So, entrepreneurs in the early factories took what used to be a skill, took what used to be a lot of knowledge about making their product that each of the employees, each of the people trained in that skill, that they all had to know in order to be able to work as a shoemaker or a cooper or a blacksmith or whatever. And they broke that skill down into little parts. And they train less skilled employees how to do each step, and they don't pay them that much. And then at the end of the day, those unskilled employees, each doing their own little step, will have produced a lot of fairly cheap, not necessarily high quality product of whatever you're selling, shoes in this example, that then you can ship off to your customers, and they don't cost that much, which means that you can compete and you can get more customers and sell more volume. That process of taking a skill, taking the making of a particular product and breaking it down into parts, that is a smart way to compete on this economic marketplace. But what it does mean is that the person who owns the factory is going to make money. The people who work in the factory, not so much. Because they don't have any skills, they don't have any leverage. If you have a skill and then you want to quit, your boss is probably going to say, all right, well, I need you. You're not easy to replace. But if everybody who's working in the factory takes them like an hour to be trained on whatever the simple step that they're doing, if they want to quit, fine. If they get sick, fine. Easy to replace. And that'll keep the labor costs down because the person who has all the leverage is the guy who trained them, the person who owns the factory, and the people who are doing the job, they have no skill at all anymore. Workers who see this happening really, really got upset because in their lifetimes, as the market revolution is happening, as these new factories are opening up, as entrepreneurs are changing the nature of work, what started out as a valuable skill suddenly has been watered down into these tiny little steps. that anybody can do. And so workers refer to this process of taking a project, the creation of a product that took lots of skill, and dividing it up into steps that anybody could do with no skill at all. Workers call that the bastardization of craft. To bastardize something is to take something pure and to water it down, to make it less pure, to make it something that no one would be proud of. So they're upset when they call it this because it's taking what they used to know and making it worth less, making it less valuable, making them less likely to get hired to do something that they used to be able to do. As more and more, this is what workplaces are. As other entrepreneurs start doing the same sort of a thing, people with skills can't find jobs. If you want to work in the shoemaking industry, either you start your own shoe company or you go to work for one of the other shoe companies and you take one of these unskilled jobs where you're standing there. It's not an assembly line, that's machinery. This is just different people do the different jobs for very little pay. And the workers who have very little other choice take these jobs, recognize that their quality of living, their pay, their status has all gone down as a result. And that's why they call it the bastardization of craft, because they're not happy about it. They think that something valuable, something that was important to them, something that's important to the whole country is being taken away, is watered down, is being broken up. It's not something that they think people should be proud of. Now, that process does mean that the products are cheaper. It does mean that more people can buy things. It does mean that overall, the standard of living for the country goes up as more people can buy stuff, as more people have access to things that previously would have been luxury goods for cheaper prices. That's overall good for people in the country, but it's bad for those employees. It's bad for the workers. It's bad for people engaged in what used to be skilled artisanal work, and they're angry about it. They're not just angry by calling it a mean name, they're angry enough that they want to fight it because they see these changes happening and they can tell that if they're going to work in these industries, their bosses, the people running the factories, are going to do everything they can to get as much work out of them as possible, to make as much profit out of them as possible, and they have very little leverage. This leads to the first examples of labor unions, where workers try to band together and try to collectively make sure that their pay or their status or their decision making in the workplace is something that they can still control. It also leads to workers getting into politics, because this is in a country where many decisions are made by elected officials and where republicanism, that emphasis on citizenship and the way the citizens of all classes have a say in running the country, uh, many of the workers, as these economic changes are happening, they got into politics. In places like New York, New England, where the market revolution is happening, where the bastardization of craft is happening, in those places, workers collectively tried to band together in what were typically called working man's parties, where they tried locally to band together and support candidates who would work for them. They want, for example, the bastardization of craft to be illegal in their town or in their county. Um, they're fighting against economic changes that are bigger than any one little town or any one group of 100 or 200 workers can ever fight, and probably not even all of them, if they all got together, can fight. But they didn't have enough success at the local level. So there's working men's parties in New York, and there's working men's parties in Philadelphia, and there's working men's parties in Trenton, New Jersey, and other places where early kinds of these new factories are happening. They were not able to get the kind of changes that they wanted at the political level, and they realized within a few years that being a separate political party, a tiny little local party, was not going to work. They weren't going to have the kind of effect that they needed to try to stop these changes that they knew were pulling them down. So they needed help from something bigger. And at the same time, the two political parties of the party system developed by Martin Van Buren, Remember him? That was being developed. And so, as the working men's parties really didn't work out, the workers in these new factories are looking for help from one of the two major political parties that would be on their side and will help them with their issues as their lives are being changed by these dramatic economic effects. Well, your choices, if you're the workers, are the Whigs or the Democrats. The Whigs are not going to be their choice. The Whigs are the party of their bosses. The Whigs are the party of big business. The Whigs are the party of economic development. The Democrats, on the other hand, although they have been the party really of the farmer, their rhetoric is opposed to the big businesses that are starting to dominate New York and New England. And the Democrats of Van Buren and Andrew Jackson had defined themselves as the party of the common man. So it's not a huge shift for the Democrats to reach out to the workers as that class of people is beginning to grow as the market revolution and things like the bastardization of craft are taking off in the North. Van Buren, who is from the North, who is from New York, who sees these economic changes going, Van Buren encouraged the Democratic Party to join the workers and bring them into their coalition. And as a result, he and other leading Democrats began to pull Northern workers into the Democratic Party, explaining that they all had the same philosophy, which was to work together for the benefit of the common man against the Northern elites, the business people who were pushing everybody else around. That led to an incredibly effective and very large coalition because as those workers in the growing economy of the market economy of the North, as those workers joined the Democratic Party and began to be really the largest force of voters, especially in northern cities where a lot of these early factories are, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, places like that. Now, by the end of the 1830s, as these changes are happening and as the Democrats are reaching out to the workers who are being affected by those changes, the Democrats now are a coalition of Southerners and Westerners, the farmers, and the Northern workers, which means that that coalition that was put together by Jackson, but also by Van Buren, they should never lose. I mean, who's left to vote for the Whigs? The Whigs are always going to be a little minor sideshow. The Democrats should win every election unless something weird happens. There's a reason why you never heard of the Whigs, because they don't win that much. But they do have their moments. So this coalition put together by shrewd politician Martin Van Buren with the leadership of Andrew Jackson and others, this coalition should be very effective. But I take it back to Martin Van Buren when president in 1836 through his term starts in 1837. The Panic of 1837 crushed him politically. And in fact, the Whigs, who were pretty new, just barely gotten started, the Whigs realized that the Panic of 1837 had given them an opportunity. Because Van Buren, leader of the country at the time of the Panic of 1837, everyone was blaming him for that. And so the Whigs, they can run a candidate against Martin Van Buren in 1840 and win, even though normally that coalition of the Democrats should be able to defeat them because everybody hates Van Buren. So the Whigs in 1840 got their act together and they nominated William Henry Harrison, who you will remember was, among other things, a war hero. He had been the leading guy in the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, so he had fought against Native Americans in 1811 against Tecumseh's brother, and then he'd also been a hero in the War of 1812. No Andrew Jackson, but he had had his successes. So he's got this war hero persona to him. I'll point out that was a long time ago. This is 1840. That was back in 1811 and 1812, so he's not a young man anymore. But he has a war hero background. He's got Western connections, so we can pull in some people who normally vote for Democrats for those reasons. We can pull in patriotism, but also he's not Martin Van Buren. And as long as he's not Martin Van Buren, people are going to vote for him because they're ticked off at Martin Van Buren for the economy. So the Whigs and William Henry Harrison as their candidate, they don't have to do much. They just need to make sure that they run just a campaign. They don't have to really say anything. Everybody hates Martin Van Buren because they are so angry at the way the economy had collapsed. And therefore, the Whigs in 1840 don't really run a traditional campaign. They don't talk about the issues. They don't talk about what this guy is going to do to solve the problems of the country. He basically just sort of sits back and does very little. Um, Early in the campaign, a Democrat made fun of Harrison for not really doing anything, for not really saying anything, and also trying to imply that he was too old and over the hill. And this Democrat said that Harrison really doesn't want to live in the White House. He doesn't really want to be president. He actually just wants to go back home to Ohio and sit on his log cabin and sip cider. The implication being he's a hick, but also he just sort of, he should be retired. They should put him out to pasture. Well, the Whigs heard about this and they decided that was their issue. What's wrong with a log cabin? It's American. What's wrong with sipping cider? Everybody drinks hard cider. What's wrong with being a good American? What's wrong with you Democrats that you don't understand that that's what being a good American is all about? And the next thing you know, the Whigs say, vote for Harrison because of log cabin and cider, which doesn't mean anything. They offer people, if you vote for the Whigs, we will give you cider. And that's hard cider. It's alcoholic. They're basically promising, vote for our candidate and we'll get you drunk. They make posters and rally pins and signs that say log cabin and cider. Vote for Harrison. Vote for the Whigs. The Democrats point out that doesn't mean anything. Like, what is that saying about who he's going to be as president? But the Whigs have figured out, among other things, that politics, as the Jacksonian democracy is starting to change politics, and as more voters are getting into politics, politics doesn't have to be about ideas anymore. It can be about emotions, and it can be about symbols. It doesn't have to be about substance. It can be about things that make people angry or things that make people excited. And so the Whigs in 1840, they ran a campaign about symbols. They ran a campaign to get people excited. They ran a campaign to get people mad at the other guy. They don't necessarily run a campaign to solve anything, but Martin Van Buren, the architect of the two-party system, Martin Van Buren, who came up with many of the ideas of political parties, Martin Van Buren in 1840 got crushed by Harrison and the Whigs in a campaign that after he's over says, what even was that about? I can't believe that they beat me on a slogan as stupid as log cabin and cider, which doesn't even mean anything. So Van Buren went back to New York City or to New York State and was very grumpy about having been steamrolled in an election that wasn't his fault. It really was Jackson's fault. And in a campaign that doesn't have anything to do with anything, the political genius of his time had been outsmarted by kind of a dumb campaign. But then he sat in New York and watched as the Whigs, who should have been able to take advantage of this opportunity, basically self-destructed. The Whigs are very snake-bitten. One of the reasons you've never heard of the Whigs is that they really don't have a lot of success in this era electing people. They're a political party. They're supposed to be able to succeed from time to time. If the Whig Party comes and knocks on your door during the few decades that they exist and they ask you to run for president, slam the door in their face. Because people who ran for president as the Whig candidate before they went out of business, either they lost, and they usually lost badly, or they won, and then things got even worse for them. So Harrison, the first successful Whig president, takes office in early 1841. But Harrison, who was an old man, had been very humiliated by the way the Democrats had made fun of his age and implied that he was too weak to serve in office. And so the day that he's being sworn in 1841, for his inauguration in Washington, D.C., was one of those cold, bitter cold, wet damp to your bones kind of days that DC gets during the winter sometimes. And of course, they don't have any of the modern conveniences like, heat or anything along those lines. So, it's cold, damp, and he is cold to the bones. He has written a long inaugural address. It actually is going to be the longest inaugural address of any president ever. It goes on for hours. He's got a lot of things in his mind because he's the first Whig president. He wants to make sure that he gets things going in a Whiggy way. So he's got this long speech prepared. He's going to go outside and deliver the speech on his inaugural day. His wife encouraged him to bundle up, but he said, no, I'm not going to bother bundling up because, I want to show them that I'm just as rugged as any Andrew Jackson ever was. And he goes out, makes the speech, catches a terrible cold. And 6 weeks later, the cold had developed into pneumonia and he died, showing a lot about the kind of medical care available to people, even a president in 1841. The guy was president for 6 weeks and was sick the whole time. Poor William Henry Harrison. All right. Well, this is the first time the president ever died in office. And they know kind of what's supposed to happen because there is a vice president. And so the vice president then finishes up the term. But it had never really happened before, so they weren't really sure. Does this mean the vice president really is the president now and can make decisions? Or is the vice president sort of like a caretaker who sort of steps in and just does what he thinks that his boss would have done? Is it really, really how this is going to? And oh, by the way, who is the president? This vice president takes over the first time this ever happened. They really kind of ignored the previous vice presidents. The job is kind of a lame job. John Adams, the first ever vice president, said this job is an abortion. And I think that he meant that in a not very nice way. So most of the time, vice president is a job that, But in this case, this vice president gets to take over, but no one really thought that that would ever happen. And they had, when they put the Whig ticket together in 1840, Harrison was the president. He's the candidate for president. They wanted to get some strength in the South. And remember, some of the Whigs at the very beginning were John Calhoun style ultra states' rights Southerners. That's not where they're going to wind up in the long run. But at first, some people were. And so to help keep the balance and to get votes from different areas of the country, Harrison from the Midwest is your presidential candidate. They pick a guy from Virginia named John Tyler as the vice presidential candidate, and it gave him the cute slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. But no one thought Tyler too is going to wind up as president, and now he's going to be president for basically an entire presidential term. Well, John Tyler, it turns out, is not really in line with most of the rest of the Whigs. He is basically John Calhoun-esque in the sense of he was a Whig because he hated Jackson. He believes in an ultra states' rights, limited federal government, everything that Henry Clay and Daniel Webster and the rest of the Whigs did not believe in. And it turns out that he believes these things very strongly. For the rest of his presidency, whenever any kind of government expansion or any kind of spending of the government money or anything that the rest of the Whigs believe in, anytime ever any of that stuff got passed through Congress and went to his desk, he vetoed it and sent it right back. And eventually, the Whigs got so annoyed with him because he doesn't agree with any of the things that the rest of the party believes in, they threw him out of the party. By the end of his presidency, he's a man without a party. And people behind the scenes start referring to him not as His Excellency, they call him His Accidency, which is cute. Well, there's no chance that John Tyler is going to scare anybody politically when it comes time for the next presidential election. I mean, he doesn't have anybody even to nominate him. The Whigs have basically fallen apart because they elected a president who died, and then they're fighting with their own president, which means if you're Martin Van Buren, I mean, it seems like an easy one because Van Buren is still a relatively young man. Van Buren essentially created the Democratic Party. And in 1844, as the economy had restored itself, no thanks to John Tyler, Van Buren figured that he could get the nomination of the Democrats again because they'd have to nominate him. It's his party. And then he could win easily against the Whigs, who are a mess. And he could have a successful presidential term and erase everybody's memories of the bad times of his previous presidential term. But it didn't work out that way because John Tyler, as president, and his Secretary of State, John C. Calhoun, and they are very simpatico, these guys decided that they were going to, on their way out the door, it's 1844, they don't expect to be in the White House much longer, but they decided that it was time to do something about Texas. Remember that legacy of Jackson? In 1844, President Tyler demanded that Congress annex Texas, which meant that that's going to be the big issue that year. Van Buren wants desperately to be president. First, he's got the Democrats, he needs to get them to nominate him. He decided on Texas in 1844 to do what he did while president, which is straddle the issue and not say yes or no. Because he figured if he said yes, then all the northern Democrats wouldn't support him. But if he said yes, no, if he says no, then none of the Southerners are going to vote for him. So he just sort of hems and haws and says, well, we'll decide later or whatever. And that had worked for him while he was president, but it didn't work this time because enough Southerners in the Democratic Party are demanding that Texas get annexed that they can look for another candidate who will give them what they want. It turns out that in 1844, the Democrats spurned Martin Van Buren. He is not good enough on the Texas issue for the Southern Democrats, and they dumped him and eventually picked a guy who nobody had ever heard of before, a guy from Tennessee named James K. Polk. Polk is selected as the Democratic nominee because all the Southerners know that he will give them Texas, and none of the Northerners have ever heard of him. And then Polk, not only this nobody from out of nowhere, dark horse candidate, got the Democratic nomination, but then he swept to an easy victory and became president in the election of 1844. And if you're Martin Van Buren, you're saying, that should have been me. This is my party. I created that party. How dare those Southern Democrats take away from me my chance at vindication? In fact, as it turns out, and I'll talk more about James K. Polk's presidency later, but there are some people who think that James K. Polk is the most successful president in American history. That should have been me, Martin Van Buren says. Well, he has one more shot, because Polk, when he got the nomination in 1844, promised that he would only serve one term, which theoretically means that 4 years later that Van Buren could try again to get the Democratic nomination. And the Democrats, they should always win. They've got that coalition of farmers from the South and the West, plus workers from the North. That should win elections unless you have a bizarre event like the Panic of 1837 to make everybody mad. Not an issue right now. So in 1848, he could have tried to get the Democratic nomination again, but Van Buren was so mad at the Democrats for not letting him have his chance in 1844, and so upset at the way slavery was the slavery issue that is really the key to Texas, that Van Buren, late in his career, in 1848, decided to accept the nomination of a different party, not the Whigs. The Whigs, forget the Whigs. Instead, he accepted the nomination of a new party, a third party created pretty much just for this election, called the Free Soil Party, which is an anti-slavery party. Van Buren knows he can't win. He has no chance of winning. An anti-slavery party is only going to get votes in the North, and even not that many. But he knew that if he, one of the most prominent politicians in the country, took the nomination of the Free Soil Party, that he would get votes that normally would go to the Democratic candidate. He is looking for revenge. By taking the Free Soil nomination, he succeeded in stealing some Democratic votes away from the Democratic candidate in 1848 and helped the Whigs elect a candidate for the second and only time that they elected a president by splitting the Democratic vote in his revenge against their stealing his chance 4 years earlier. Now, I'm going to come back to some of the politics of the 1840s and tell that not from the Martin Van Buren point of view. It's a little bit of a preview. But one final thought is that Van Buren had started out as a candidate and then as a president who was in almost every way, except for Texas, incredibly pro-South and therefore pro-slavery. And then he finished up his political career as the candidate of a third party that was an anti-slavery party. Among other things, his transformation mirrors a transformation that is going on in the North as anti-slavery voices are beginning to be heard louder and louder the farther you get into the 1830s and then 40s and eventually to the 1850s. His lifetime reflects that. His political career reflects that. Well, we're going to get to that politics of the way slavery turns out in the 1840s and 50s. That's going to be a big theme of the rest of the course. But before we do that, it's going to be important for us to understand slavery itself a little bit better so that we can understand the institution that some people are beginning to criticize more than just slaves do. So, next class, we're going to have a deep dive into what was going on in the South on those plantations. It is going to be a difficult topic, very unpleasant because slavery is one of those awful things that's ever happened in American history. So, prepare yourself for that as much as you can. I will see you on Thursday for that discussion of slavery. And in the meantime, stay well.